Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and I'd like to present in this brief video information regarding investigating cannibalism, dismemberment, and mutilation. I will present two studies and then some details from the profiling literature. In the first study, what we will focus on is dismemberment and mutilation, and in the second study, cannibalism will be brought into the discussion. The first study is based on Petrarca et al. 2020 work, Dismemberment and Mutilation, a data-driven exploration of patterns, motives, and styles, from the Journal of Forensic Sciences, volume 65, pages 888 to 896. Now, we can go ahead and first define mutilation and dismemberment, and then look at some of the general types of mutilation and dismemberment. Mutilation is the disfigurement or the body part or organ removal, while dismemberment is where larger body parts are removed. So certainly we've seen cases of mutilation and or dismemberment in the serial murder literature that we've reviewed in our class and in our criminal profiling class as well. But let's look at the types. The general types are the defensive, and the defensive type is where the goal is to dispose of or hide the body. In other words, it is to hide or destroy the evidence of the crime. The aggressive type is based on rage or overkill. And in these cases, we have someone who has a high emotional level of anger and rage, and carries out a homicide, and then also engages in overkill behavior through mutilation or dismemberment as part of that rage response. The offensive type is based on sexual desire, fantasy, or sadism. In other words, someone is using their sexual deviancy and deviant desires, violent desires and fantasies in this case. And then in the in the necromaniac, we have someone who is collecting a trophy, keeping a body part perhaps, cutting out or off a body part, and also utilizing that as a symbol, and also sometimes as a fetish for their sexual arousal and behaviors. Communication focuses on sending a message to a group, sending a message to a group of threat, trying to demonstrate dominance over another group. And so we've seen all these types: defensive, aggressive, offensive, necromaniac, communication. And also the authors point out that we can start classifying offenders as organized or disorganized types following the FBI typologies that have been presented a number of years ago. In their study, they collected data from a serial killer database and also from books and media reports. And they ended up with 100 cases that they selected for their analysis. And they coded the variables based on motives for the actual murder and for the dismemberment and mutilation. And also the organizational level, the weapons, methods, and the behaviors. So let's look at some of the results, and I'm just going to briefly go over a few of their findings, and you can certainly obtain the article and get much more detail. But 87% were male perpetrators and 55% were female victims. 20% of the perpetrators had abuse history, 33% substance abuse, and 30% had known psychological or psychiatric diagnoses. And 53% of the perpetrators had a previous criminal record. They found in regards to the motivation for the murder that they found anger-related and mental health issues were discovered to be primary murder motivations. And then for the dismemberment and mutilation motivations, found basically practical motives as well as anger-related tended to be more common. 55% had more than one dismemberment mutilation victim. So we definitely, connect this with serial murder. I've certainly seen cases before. In fact, I consulted on a case where they had mutilation and they had dismemberment, and it was a case of one victim for that particular perpetrator. As far as we knew, the perpetrator had not been charged with any other homicide, although they did have a lengthy criminal record for all kinds of other violent and non-violent offenses. If we look at the different styles of dismemberment mutilation, that 60% were considered defensive, 26% offensive, and 14% aggressive. So also they point out that the murder motive and the dismemberment mutilation motive did not always match up. So you could have an aggressive motive for the murder followed by defensive motive, for example, for the mutilation. 68% of the cases had an organized pattern for both murder and dismemberment and mutilation, and 14% disorganized for both. And so you could actually have difference in terms of disorganized and organized type regarding murder and or dismemberment or mutilation. So it gets more complex with the patterns here, of course. You have to carefully assess that. And the defensive and the offensive types tended to be more organized offenders, and while the aggressive types tended to be more disorganized. And the article actually has a great chart that really helps you if you're investigating this type of case to look at specific factors. So again, interesting article there, giving us some additional information. If we move to study 2, this is also by Petrica et al. And published in 2021, titled Criminal Cannibalism, an Examination of Patterns and Styles. And this is from Aggression and Violent Behavior, volume 56, and this article just came out. So cannibalism basically is eating the human flesh of another. There's 2 basic types of cannibalism. There's endocannibalism and exocannibalism. So endocannibalism is eating a group member, and exocannibalism is eating an outsider. And we'll focus basically on the exocannibalism type. Further differentiation focuses on the extent and nature of removal of body parts in this study. And again, the authors who also completed the first study I discussed talk about dismemberment being the removal of a large piece of the body, while mutilation is the disfigurement or removal of a smaller piece. And we can even break that down further to castration or evisceration or flaying of the skin. 3 styles again are brought into the analysis here. So we are focusing primarily here, the authors are focusing on the defensive, or to hide the body, the aggressive, which is rage-based, and the offensive, which tends to be sexual. And they also considered the organizational level of the perpetrator, as well as external group influences, and also we'll take a look at the results in terms of cannibalism versus dismemberment only. So they used 60 cases from the database that was used in the first study, which is basically the Radford, Florida Gulf Coast University serial killer database. And they also use court documents and media reports. So if you're doing some research on serial murder, you may want to explore getting permission to use the Radford, Florida Gulf Coast University serial killer database. It has a wealth of information. I have not used that database in a while, but I'm going to have to reactivate my account because of the excellent information it has. So they found, again, mostly male perpetrators in both groups. I think I mentioned they used 60 cases in this study. And both groups had some perpetrators with documented mental health disorders. The sex of the victim was similar for both groups, but strangers were more likely as victims in the cannibalism group. So strangers were more likely to be victims in the cannibalism group. The cannibals were more likely to fall into the offensive category, while the dismemberment-only group were more likely to fall into the defensive group. Remember, the defensive group is trying to hide the body, and so that, or dispose of the evidence. Both groups are more likely to be organized, but their differences, if we look at the categories and subcategories, basically. They had a subgroup, for example, of cannibals who were disorganized and mentally impaired. And you can read more about that in this study. So we get different categorizations here, basically. They also found that plea deals as well as civil commitment were more likely in the cannibal group. And what I'm going to do is quote from page 4 of their study. I think this is a very important finding. Quote, "We observed remarkable similarities between cannibals and offenders who only dismembered or mutilated their victims. This suggested that cannibalism might best be conceptualized as a subcategory dismemberment and mutilation, in which an offender simply goes beyond mutilation or dismemberment to ultimately eat all or part of the victim for a number of possible reasons, which may or may not be consistent with the reasons for the murder and the dismemberment or mutilation of the victim's body." So you can see we really have a lot more complexity here in conducting our analysis. And really, I highly recommend you get both of these articles if you're interested in pursuing this research, or if you're actually investigating these types of crimes. We don't see a lot of these crimes occurring, and many criminal justice professionals will complete their career without seeing these types of cases, but others will specialize in these types of cases and see multiple ones over their career. If we move back to thinking about criminal profiling and analyzing the crime scene, I'd like to pull in here some information from Holmes and Holmes Criminal Profiling textbook, and that book is published in 2009, Profiling Violent Crimes, 4th edition, published by Sage. But Holmes and Holmes point out that homicide detectives are usually trained to reconstruct crime scenes using the physical evidence that they have there, but it is recommended to focus on the non-physical factors and to look at the relationships between physical and non-physical evidence. Also, using the FBI typology that primarily focused on lust offenders, but is very useful for looking at what we're doing here. They looked at the disorganized asocial offenders and the organized non-social offenders. Now, in my criminal profiling class, we go into much more details on the personality characteristics of the organized and the disorganized offenders, and the interviewing strategies and crime scene behaviors. Here, what I'm going to do is just focus on 2 slides, looking at crime scene differences of organized non-socials and the disorganized asocials, and then you can go ahead and put that more into perspective with the cannibalism, mutilation, dismemberment research studies. But if we look at the crime scene differences, basically the organized offender tends to plan the offense and target strangers, tends to control conversation and interaction with the victim, and tends to have more of a controlled crime scene, as well as a submissive victim. They may use restraints and also aggressive behaviors. They may move the body and remove a weapon and may leave very little evidence. In contrast, the disorganized offender is more likely to engage when compared to the organized. The disorganized offender is more likely to engage in spontaneous violent behavior. The victim is more likely to be unknown. A victim is depersonalized by the offender, minimal conversation and interaction. The crime scene is often chaotic, and the violence is pretty sudden. Also, the disorganized tends to not use restraints. The disorganized is more likely than the organized to have sexual interactions, engage in sexual behaviors after the death of the victim. The body may be left where the person was killed. They may also leave a weapon, and they may leave a lot more physical evidence behind. And so that's important to recognize as well. And finally, I'll start wrapping up here, and I have more of a analysis from looking at cannibalism, mutilation, and that has occurred during genocide. So a lot of my research is focused on genocide. As certainly if you're in any of my classes, you know that almost every class I tend to bring in genocide, whatever the course might be, because that's really the area that I have specialized in over the years in my teaching and research. But I have seen group cannibalism, and also I've seen group cannibalism and dismemberment and mutilation in genocide cases. And in some of the cases that I've used in my own research, it was actually groups of perpetrators that engaged in dismemberment and mutilation. And so this is another dimension too, where we begin to ask, if we want to look at, are the offenders alone or are they with another person? In the serial murder literature, you'll find offenders can maybe alone, or maybe they're with another person or even a third person, but you tend not to have large groups of serial killers hanging out together committing murder. In the cases that I've studied in genocides, in one case apparently you had a dozen or so men that were engaged in mutilation and dismemberment activities. And in one case, they forced one victim to mutilate another victim and then killed them. So that's another area to look at as well, and how I try to kind of put it into perspective with my own research. I highly recommend, if you like to pursue more details from these studies, to go ahead and get the original articles. And thank you.